Most people spend their entire lives trying to be liked, and they never stop to notice that it isn't working. Not in the way that matters, not in the rooms where it counts, the negotiation, the introduction, the first 5 seconds after you walk through a door. People sense something about you before you've spoken a word, before you've offered your hand, before you've said anything at all. They sense it from the way you carry the space around your body, from the particular quality of your attention, from whether you seem to need the room or whether the room seems to need you. Most people enter rooms, hoping to be received well, hoping to make a good impression, hoping that the assembled group will extend them something, warmth, validation, acknowledgement. And that hope, quiet as it is, invisible as it tries to be, is readable. It radiates. And other people, without consciously knowing why, respond to it by withholding exactly what's being sought. This is the dynamic almost no one talks about, because it requires a level of honesty that's uncomfortable. It requires admitting that your own need for approval, even in its most subtle socially acceptable forms, is actively undermining the authority you're trying to build. It requires sitting with the fact that the energy you bring into a room is not a neutral thing. It is information, and people read it with extraordinary precision, even when they have no framework for what they're reading. What you're about to work through is not a set of social tricks. It is not a collection of posture tips or voice modulation techniques or scripted phrases designed to manufacture an impression. Those things exist. They fill shelves, and they produce a particular kind of person, someone who has learned to perform confidence without ever developing the interior that makes confidence real. People sense the difference. They always have. What Niccolo Machiavelli spent his career studying was something more fundamental. He watched men of power move through the world, through courts and councils, through alliances formed and broken, through moments of high visibility and deep crisis, and he noticed that the ones who commanded genuine respect shared a common architecture, not a common style, not a common temperament. Something more structural than that. A quality of interior organization that expressed itself outward, consistently, regardless of context. That quality is what we're going to build toward, principle by principle. Not quickly. Nothing real is built quickly, but with the kind of precision that makes the construction permanent. #1. The weight of your arrival. Consider a meeting you've attended, a professional setting, a social gathering, any room with people who don't yet know how to calibrate you. Think about the people who entered that room, and, within seconds, the entire social atmosphere shifted slightly. Not because they announced themselves, not because they said something clever or performed some scripted entrance, simply because they walked in a particular way, with a particular quality of movement that communicated, without any words at all, that they were entirely at home inside their own skin. Now think about the others, the ones who entered and immediately began the small performances. The too broad smile, the slightly too loud greeting, the rapid scan of the room for someone to anchor to. Someone familiar, someone who would provide the social validation that made the entrance feel complete. You've seen this. Most people in that room were one of these two things, and the difference between them had nothing to do with how they looked or what they wore or how objectively successful they were. The difference was gravitational. One person entered as though the room was a place they had been invited into. The other entered as though the room was a test they needed to pass. Machiavelli observed that the posture a leader carried was not decoration. It was policy. It communicated to everyone watching exactly how much authority the leader believed they possessed, and that belief was then adopted, almost without question, by the observers. Human beings are extraordinarily efficient at reading hierarchy. We evolved this capacity over hundreds of thousands of years. The signals are subtle, but the processing is fast, and it happens below the threshold of conscious thought. What this means, practically, is that the authority you project in the first moments of entering a room is not primarily about technique. It is about the quality of your relationship with yourself. Do you believe genuinely in your body rather than in your performance that you have a right to occupy the space you're occupying? Not arrogance, not dominance in the aggressive sense. Simply the quiet, settled conviction that you are not an imposition, that you don't need to earn the right to be present, that your arrival is not a request for admission, but a simple fact. Most people have not built this. They have built, instead, a practiced performance of it, which is why it dissolves under pressure. When the social situation becomes genuinely high stakes, when the people in the room are genuinely powerful, when the outcome genuinely matters, the performance collapses, and what's underneath becomes visible. The interior work, the slow, unglamorous process of developing actual self-possession, is the only thing that holds under those conditions. And it begins with something almost embarrassingly simple: learning to slow down. The person who enters a room at the pace of their own choosing, who doesn't accelerate in response to the ambient social energy, who doesn't rush to fill the silence, that person has already communicated something real, something that techniques cannot manufacture. Your arrival is your first statement. Make it honest. 2. What your eyes are doing when you think no one is watching. There is a specific behavior that reveals more about a person's internal state than almost any other, more than their words, more than their posture, even. It's the movement of their eyes during conversation, during a presentation, during a difficult moment in a meeting where something unexpected has been said. Watch a person whose confidence is performance-based when they're caught off guard. Watch where their eyes go. They dart, almost imperceptibly, but consistently, toward the faces of the people they're hoping to read. They are checking, scanning for approval signals, calibrating their response, not from an internal compass, but from the ambient feedback they're harvesting from the room. And the room senses it. The room senses that this person is being led rather than leading, that their direction is external rather than internal. Now watch someone who has developed genuine interior authority in the same caught-off-guard moment. There is a pause, sometimes just a second or two, and in that pause something specific happens. Their eyes settle rather than scan. They look inward for a moment rather than outward. They are consulting their own judgment rather than the room's. And when they speak, there is a particular quality to the words, not necessarily more eloquent, not necessarily better strategically, but more settled, more whole. The words come from somewhere central, rather than from a reactive surface. The Stoic tradition that influenced so much of Machiavelli's era placed enormous emphasis on this specific distinction. The language differed from ours, but the observation was identical. A man who governs himself by internal reference is categorically more stable and categorically more authoritative than a man who governs himself by external response. Not because external information is irrelevant, it isn't. Skilled observation of others is a genuine strategic asset. But there is a world of difference between choosing to read the room and needing to read the room in order to know what you think. This extends into every domain of public presence. The person who speaks and then watches for reactions and allows those reactions to visibly affect them has handed others a mechanism for control. Without knowing it, they've established a feedback loop in which the room's response determines the speaker's confidence, which affects the next statement, which affects the next response, which affects the next level of confidence. It spirals. And the people in the room, again without consciously knowing why, begin to feel the authority leaking from the interaction. Hold your own gaze first. Not literally, the specific mechanics of eye contact are a small tactical detail in a much larger strategic picture. But develop the habit of checking inward before you check outward. When you receive unexpected information, let the first movement be inward. What do I actually think about this? What is my honest assessment? Let that come first. Then, and only then, engage with the room. The people who do this consistently become the still points in high turbulence environments. Not because they're unaffected, but because they've developed the discipline to process before they respond. And in a world where almost everyone responds before they've processed, that discipline alone is enough to distinguish you. 3. The straight D value of things left once said. There is an assumption embedded in most professional and social culture that the person who talks the most is the person who knows the most. That contribution is proportional to volume. That the way to establish yourself in a room is to fill that room with analysis, with commentary, with the visible demonstration of everything you know. This assumption is wrong, and the cost of believing it is paid quietly, over years, in the slow erosion of the particular kind of authority that silence creates. Machiavelli was fascinated by leaders who understood the strategic deployment of restraint. He observed courts where the advisors who spoke least were consulted most, not because they were withholding for dramatic effect, but because their restraint was genuinely rooted in a different relationship with their own knowledge. They had nothing to prove, and that absence of a need to prove anything communicated more effectively than any demonstration could that they were in possession of something real. The psychology underneath this is interesting. When a person consistently volunteers their analysis, their opinions, their reactions, when they fill every available conversational space, they gradually establish something in the minds of others. Not authority. The opposite. The opposite. They establish that their thoughts are abundant and therefore somewhat ordinary, that their observations are reflexive rather than considered, that they speak because speaking is their default rather than because they have something specifically worth contributing. The person who speaks selectively operates from entirely different social mechanics. When they choose to speak, the room shifts slightly. There is an increase in attention that isn't manufactured. It is the natural response to scarcity. The mind elevates what is rare. And the person who has established over time that their words represent genuine consideration rather than reflexive output creates around themselves a quality of attention that more valuable people simply don't receive. This doesn't mean becoming silent or withholding or difficult to read. There are contexts where warmth and spontaneous engagement are exactly right, and the person who has misread discipline as permanent austerity has simply traded one miscalibration for another. The principle is about developing a conscious relationship with your own speech, about asking, in the moment before you speak, is this contribution adding something real, or is it filling a silence that would have served me better? A vibe silence in the right moment is not absence. It is presence of a different, denser kind. The room fills with your quiet in a way it never fills with your noise. And people, without understanding the mechanism, begin to lean toward you in anticipation of what you might eventually say. Learn to make them wait, not cynically, not as performance, but as the genuine expression of a mind that moves at its own pace rather than at the pace the room is demanding. McHarsh #4 How you carry the last difficult thing that happened to you. Here is something no one in your professional life will tell you. They can see it. Whatever the last difficult thing was, the setback, the rejection, the deal that fell through, the relationship that ended badly, the period of genuine uncertainty that you're still moving through, they can see traces of it in how you hold yourself, in a particular tension around your jaw, in the specific quality of how you respond when someone asks how things are going, in the way you laugh, whether it's free or slightly defended. They can't name what they're seeing. Most people don't have the vocabulary for it, but the reading happens anyway, automatically, as a fundamental feature of how human beings assess one another. We are constantly running, at a level well below conscious thought, an evaluation of other people's resilience. We are asking, without knowing we're asking, has this person been broken by what's happened to them, or have they moved through it? A distinction matters strategically. Not because suffering is shameful, it isn't, and anyone who has lived a full life carries their share of it, but because the way you carry your history communicates something about how you'll handle the future. And people make decisions about how much to trust you, how much to invest in you, how much of their own vulnerability to extend in your direction, based substantially on that reading. Julius Caesar, whatever else history makes of him, carried himself through reversals that would have ended most men's ambitions. What his contemporaries observed was not that he was unaffected by difficulty. They observed that he processed and moved, that the setback was visible for a time and then integrated, that he seemed to inhabit the present moment rather than being dragged backward by the accumulated weight of everything that hadn't gone right. That quality, that capacity for forward orientation even through genuine difficulty, was a significant component of the authority he projected. The Stoic practice here is specific and demanding. It requires something beyond simply performing resilience, which most people can spot, and which produces its own kind of wariness in observers, because performed resilience tends to look slightly brittle around the edges. The real practice is developing a genuine relationship with difficulty. Not the toxic positivity that insists everything is fine. Not the suppression that buries the weight somewhere it will resurface later. But an honest integration. This happened, it cost something real. And I am not going to let it define the territory in front of me. That integration takes time. It can't be rushed without becoming performance. But what you can control, even before the integration is complete, is whether the difficulty travels with you into rooms where it has no place. Whether you give it a seat at the table in contexts where your forward attention is what's required. The discipline is in the sorting. Past difficulty belongs in honest conversations with people who have earned that depth. It does not belong in professional first impressions. It does not belong in the body language of someone whose job in a given moment is to hold steady for others. Sort it correctly, and the authority in your presence compounds over time. Carry it indiscriminately, and the weight becomes visible in ways that erode the very respect you're working to build. Me, #5. The discipline of never being fully readable. There is a particular social currency that modern culture has placed enormous value on: radical transparency. The idea that openness is inherently trustworthy, that vulnerability is leadership, that the person who shares everything is the person with nothing to hide and therefore nothing to fear. There is genuine truth embedded in this. Authentic connection requires some level of genuine exposure, and there is a kind of closed, defended personality that uses opacity as armor, that mistakes being unreadable for being powerful, and produces only distance and distrust. That is not what we're discussing. What we're discussing is something more precise. There is a difference between the transparency that comes from having nothing to conceal and the transparency that comes from having no internal boundary between what you think and what you say. The first is integrity. The second is a strategic liability dressed in the language of virtue. Machiavelli observed this pattern in the behavior of effective leaders across different contexts and eras. The ones who maintained some degree of productive mystery about their full thinking, who shared selectively, who allowed others to wonder about their next move, who never quite confirmed everything that was suspected about their intentions. Those leaders held a particular kind of attention in their relationships. Others couldn't entirely close the file on them, couldn't finalize their assessment. And in that perpetual openness, a certain quality of attention and respect was maintained that full transparency would have dissolved. The psychology is rooted in something simple. Once you have fully read someone, once you believe you have complete access to their interiority, their reactions, their next moves, your attention naturally diminishes. The known is less compelling than the partially known. This is not a character flaw in your observers. It is a structural feature of how human attention operates, and working with it rather than against it is simply being realistic about how respect is maintained over time. This doesn't mean being evasive. It doesn't mean manufacturing mystery through games or withholding as manipulation. It means developing a considered relationship with what you share and when, keeping some portion of your thinking genuinely private, not hidden with drama, but simply unreleased. Not every reaction requires expression. Not every opinion requires an audience. Not every feeling needs to be named aloud in the moment it arrives. The person who has developed this quality has something rare. They are present without being predictable. They engage without being exhausted. They share genuinely without being fully consumed by the encounter. And there is a quality of attention they receive from others that is consistently elevated, because the people around them are never entirely certain they've finished reading, and so they keep reading. Be knowable, but not entirely known. The difference lives in the margin, and the margin is where authority accumulates. #6. How your relationship with discomfort announces itself. There is a room in every serious person's life, a high-pressure meeting, a challenging conversation, a moment of public scrutiny, a negotiation where the stakes are real, where the quality of their relationship with discomfort is made visible, not in a dramatic way, in the small, almost imperceptible behavioral shifts that accumulate into a portrait, the slight quickening of speech when the room goes quiet, the reach for a glass of water in a moment of searching for something to do with the hands,